Welcome everyone to Chapter 3. We're halfway through your Moodle course. So Chapter 3 introduces us to the socio-ecological model. And before we start talking about that, can we draw attention to our gig mascot? And remember to send a name for the mascot because it remains nameless.
Best name gets a prize.
Now, back to gig.
There you go.
Yeah. All right. So the socio-ecological model, what is it, Sarah?
So the socio-ecological model is a theoretical framework that we're asking students to use to help them understand some of these big, complex problems. So as you've mentioned, wicked problems. So the socio-ecological model is a model, it's been around for a very long time. It has predominantly been used in spaces such as child development or gender-based violence. And what it does is it breaks down each level of the world and our environment as we know it. So we've got the local level, the community level, the societal level, and the global level. And you've got those concentric circles. Yeah. So what the socio-ecological model wants you to think about is how the intersection between all of these different levels and how there are different factors and different stakeholders that sit at those different levels and how they intersect and how that intersection affects the issue that we're talking about, for example. So when I say factors and when I say stakeholders, I'm talking about two different things. So factors is kind of the things that we can't necessarily see. So for instance, if we're looking at the local level, we're looking at people's income levels, their race, their religion, their ethnicity, those types of things. If we're looking at the societal level, we're looking at cultural attitudes. So, for example, cultural attitudes or perceptions towards something. Whereas stakeholders, we're looking at, for instance, at the societal level, the private sector, local government. At the community level, we'd be looking at things such as schools or churches. At the global level, international organizations such as...
Or nations.
Exactly. So there's two different things that we're looking at as they're placed on the socio-ecological model.
And I'm just going to take a step back and clarify something for students for whom, again, this may be very new. So you mentioned that it is a conceptual framework. And a conceptual or theoretical framework essentially is just a way of organizing how we think about something. That's what we're referring to. So the model does that. When it comes to really complex, multi-level challenges, situations, scenarios, having this model that looks at stakeholders in these concentric circles that go all the way from the individual to the global, it's a very straightforward way of creating a system of organization for the ideas. In this instance, as you were saying before, not just the stakeholders themselves, but also the relationships between the stakeholders, because they don't exist in isolation, right? And that's part of what the model is about. And it's based on this theory that has been around for a while, which is the systems thinking. And systems thinking, it's great for what we do in the unit, but we're not really going to get into what systems thinking is in depth. But just in case you're interested, systems thinking looks at how problems, challenges, situations exist in systems, not in isolations. So in the same way that you can think about the digestive system or the respiratory system as a group of different organs that work together for a purpose, you can think about society or challenges as systems that have different factors and stakeholders that cause a system to work in a certain way. So the socio-ecological framework, the socio-ecological model is based on the idea of systems thinking because it looks in a very holistic way at challenges as systems.
Exactly. And your point there about not looking at things in isolation is really important, especially when it comes to the gig and for us to be understanding.
Which was going to be my next question. What is it for in the unit, right? So
Exactly. Yeah. And so what we want is we want students to be looking at these wicked problems from a really holistic perspective and understanding that tackling a problem at one level needs to be done in consideration of all the other levels. So for instance, if you are, at the community level, if you've got schools who are educating their children about the SDGs, once those children graduate from school, they start moving into the private sector, they start moving into government. Ideas and money flow around, and if you don't have funding that's coming from, say, the societal level, which is the government, the laws, the institutions, the regulations that make decisions about where money flows, then nothing will really happen at the community level. If you have, for instance, a law that was implemented by the federal government, let's say we're talking here in Australia, a law that's implemented, but no one's told about it at the community level or at the local level. People are just going about doing whatever they want to do. All of a sudden, perhaps someone gets in trouble for doing something, or it's not properly enforced, which happens in a lot of places where a law has been introduced, but it's not enforced. And so both communities and individuals at that local and community level are unawares, or they're just carrying on doing something. For example, fishing practices, illegal fishing practices that have been legalized, but they're not enforced. And so people are still going out and doing as they were without any kind of ramifications or consequences.
And you know what? Another thing that I find fascinating about the model and what it actually tells us about wicked problems and also the way in which being global works nowadays is that there is an interrelationship of impact between the macro forces of the world, and by that I'm talking about big things like nations, multinational companies, etc. Those big forces that shape the world, and the individual. We tend to think that it's a one-way street from top to bottom, that what these contemporary giants of our lives do dictates what we do as well. But it's a two-way street. Individuals, we have an impact on what happens globally. And similarly, we are affected by what those macro forces do, all the way up this spectrum that is outlined in the socio-ecological model. My actions, sometimes our actions as individuals, do not have a very visual, tangible effect on their own, but collectively they certainly do. So, how much water we use every day, what we do with our waste, where we put our resources, what material are we watching online, what are we purchasing, what is the history behind the production of those products. So all the collective impact of those individual actions certainly has, that shapes market forces, right? Which in turn can change political climate, etc. But also we have the anomalies, which are the individual actions of people that have a huge effect on the world, the leaders of the world, the Rosa Parks of the world that changed the history of race relations, the Greta Thunbergs of the world. And individuals can have an immense impact on the global scale. And I just get very excited about that because it's not always this top to bottom approach. It can go both ways. And the socio-ecological model is such a good way of representing that visually.
It is. It's fantastic. It demonstrates that we're not siloed. We shouldn't be siloed. And that everything is interconnected, where everything that we do has, another
an impact. And it's going to have a big impact on your assessments, because assessment 3 and 4 are pretty much all about the socio-ecological model.
Certainly is.
Assessment 3 is very much based on that, and we'll talk about it in a second when you look at the assessment videos. And assessment 4 is partly on the socio-ecological model. It touches on it, but it does a few other things. So not only is it a good way of understanding how the world is made up, it's really important to you in terms of your mark for the unit.
It is indeed. And we want, just as a kind of a final note on that, is that the reason why we've linked the SDGs into this framework as well is because we acknowledge that the SDGs are huge and they seem very grandiose and unattainable, but if we apply them to the socio-ecological model, then there's a way for us to use them in tandem to really break down these issues.
Yeah, Jim, you mentioned this in the previous chapter, how the SDGs here go in tandem with the socio-ecological.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's a wrap for chapter 3.
That's it.